Before the world called it the Vietnam War, Vietnam had another name for it. They called it the war against the Americans to save the nation. But this war did not begin with American helicopters over the jungle, or with napalm turning villages into fire, or with television cameras bringing blood and chaos into American homes. No. By the time American combat troops landed in Vietnam, the country had already been bleeding for decades. This was not simply a war between North and South Vietnam. It was a struggle born from colonial occupation, forged through revolution, and transformed into one of the most devastating battlegrounds of the Cold War. It was where communism and capitalism collided, where empires collapsed, where presidents gambled with history, and where millions of ordinary people were trapped between ideology and survival. From 1954 to 1975, Communist North Vietnam and its allies in the South, the Viet Cong, fought against the government of South Vietnam and its most powerful ally, the United States. To Washington, it was a mission to stop the spread of communism. To Hanoi, it was a war of national reunification. To the villagers caught between both armies, it was terror. It was burned homes. It was missing fathers. It was children running from bombs. By the time the war ended, the cost would be almost beyond comprehension. As many as 2 million civilians on both sides were dead. Around 1.1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong fighters were killed. The U.S. military estimated that between 200,000 and 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers died in the war. More than 58,000 Americans would never come home. Their names would later be carved into black granite at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. South Korea, fighting alongside the South, lost more than 4,000 men. Australia lost more than 500. Thailand, around 350. New Zealand, several dozen. But numbers never tell the whole story. Vietnam emerged victorious, but devastated. Its farmland poisoned. Its jungles stripped bare. Its villages destroyed. Its cities scarred by fire and artillery. Its people divided by ideology, fear, and exile. And in America, the war left something else behind. A wound of doubt. A military demoralized. A public divided. A nation forced to ask whether all of it had been worth the cost. But to understand how America became trapped in its longest and most controversial war, we must go back. Back before the Americans. Back before the Viet Cong. Back to the collapse of French colonial rule. Because Vietnam's war did not begin with the United States. It began with empire. For nearly a century, Vietnam had lived under French colonial domination. It was part of what was called French Indochina, a colonial possession that included Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. French rule brought railways, administration, and economic development. But it also brought exploitation. Land was taken. Farmers were crushed under taxes. Rubber plantations enriched French companies while Vietnamese peasants remained poor. Political dissent was punished. National identity was suppressed. To many Vietnamese, French rule was not civilization. It was occupation. Then came World War II. In 1940, as France collapsed before Nazi Germany, Japan moved into Indochina. The French colonial administration remained, but now under Japanese control. Vietnam had become a colony inside a colony. And during this chaos, a revolutionary movement was born. Its leader was a man who would become one of the most important figures of the 20th century. Ho Chi Minh. A nationalist, a communist, a revolutionary. Ho believed that Vietnam could only be free through total independence. Inspired by both Soviet communism and anti-colonial nationalism, he formed the Viet Minh, the League for the Independence of Vietnam. At first, they fought the Japanese occupation. Then, after Japan's surrender in 1945, they turned their focus back to the French. In September 1945, standing in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He even quoted the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. But France had no intention of letting Vietnam go. The First Indochina War began in 1946. It would last 8 brutal years. France fought to restore colonial control. The Viet Minh fought to end it forever. At first, the French believed victory was only a matter of time. They had better weapons, professional armies, foreign support. And increasingly, that support came from the United States. Washington saw the war not simply as colonial resistance, but as part of the global struggle against communism. As the Cold War intensified, America began funding France's war effort. Weapons, supplies, money. By the early 1950s, the United States was paying for much of France's war in Indochina. But money could not buy victory. Because the Viet Minh were not fighting for territory alone. They were fighting for history, for identity, for a nation. And nowhere would that become clearer than at a place called Dien Bien Phu. May 1954. Deep in a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam, near the border with Laos, the French built what they believed would be an unbreakable fortress. Dien Bien Phu. It was meant to lure the Viet Minh into open battle. French commanders believed their firepower and air support would crush them. The valley was surrounded by mountains, but the French considered that an advantage. They believed the enemy could never move heavy artillery through such impossible terrain. They were wrong. The Viet Minh did the impossible. Piece by piece, inch by inch. They dragged artillery through mountains, mud, and jungle by hand. Thousands of men and women hauled guns with ropes and bicycles. They built roads where none existed. They dug trenches that crawled slowly toward French lines. Then they opened fire. The siege began. French positions were pounded day and night. Supplies became scarce. Air support failed. Morale collapsed. The fortress became a trap. And the world watched as the mighty colonial army of France was slowly strangled by peasants with discipline, patience, and absolute determination. On May 7, 1954, Dien Bien Phu fell. It was not just a military defeat. It was the death of French colonial power in Indochina. The empire had collapsed. And suddenly, the future of Vietnam was no longer a colonial question. It was an international crisis. That summer, world powers gathered at the Geneva Conference. Their task: decide the future of Vietnam. The result was the Geneva Accords of July 1954. Vietnam would be divided at the 17th parallel. North of the line would be the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Workers' Party. Its capital, Hanoi. South of the line would remain under the state of Vietnam, centered in Saigon, and nominally led by former Emperor Bao Dai. A demilitarized zone, the DMZ, would separate them. The partition was supposed to be temporary. Within 300 days, civilians could move north or south depending on where they wished to live. And in 1956, nationwide elections would be held to reunify the country. At least, that was the promise. But almost immediately, it became clear those elections would never happen. Because another superpower had entered the game. The United States. President Dwight D. Eisenhower viewed Vietnam not as a nationalist struggle, but as the next frontline in the global war against communism. Washington feared what became known as the domino theory. If Vietnam fell to communism, Laos might fall. Then Cambodia. Then Thailand. Then perhaps all of Southeast Asia. And beyond that, the credibility of American power itself. For Eisenhower, losing Vietnam was not an option. The United States accepted the division of Vietnam as temporary. But only if communism could be stopped in the South. That meant one thing: finding a strong anti-communist leader. They found him in Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was not charismatic. He was not popular. But he was disciplined, fiercely anti-communist, and absolutely determined. To Washington, that was enough. A covert American operation known as the Saigon Military Mission began in June 1954 under Colonel Edward Lansdale. Its purpose was not only military support, but psychological warfare, intelligence operations, and political engineering. The CIA quietly moved behind the scenes. American advisors trained South Vietnamese forces. Political rivals were pressured, bribed, or removed. Aid agencies poured money into the fragile southern state. Nearly 900,000 refugees fled from communist North Vietnam into the south, many of them Catholics who feared life under Ho Chi Minh's rule. The United States helped resettle them. This strengthened Diem politically and weakened the North's hopes for peaceful reunification. Meanwhile, Viet Minh leaders were already preparing for the future. Even as many of their military forces withdrew north of the 17th parallel under the Geneva terms, they left behind political operatives, organizers, and propagandists in the South. They expected the 1956 elections to reunify Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh. Most believed he would win easily. Even President Eisenhower later admitted that perhaps 80% of the population would have voted for Ho. Diem understood that. And so did Washington. Which is why the elections would never be allowed to happen. By late 1955, Diem had moved aggressively. He defeated armed religious sects, neutralized rival military factions, arrested communist operatives, and publicly rejected nationwide elections. Instead, he held a referendum only in the South. It was heavily manipulated. The result was never in doubt. Bao Dai was removed. Ngo Dinh Diem declared himself president of the Republic of Vietnam. South Vietnam had been born. The North protested, but could do little. It was not ready for another war. Neither China nor the Soviet Union wanted immediate escalation. For the moment, Hanoi waited. But beneath the surface, the next war had already begun. South Vietnam had been born. But it was born fragile. Behind the flags, the speeches, and the American promises, the new republic stood on unstable ground. Ngo Dinh Diem had survived his early enemies. He had defeated rival sect armies. He had pushed aside Bao Dai. He had blocked the national elections that might have handed victory to Ho Chi Minh. To Washington, he looked like proof that South Vietnam could survive. But beneath that appearance of stability lay the seeds of collapse. Diem ruled not like a national unifier, but like the head of a family empire. Power did not flow through institutions. It flowed through blood. His younger brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, became his closest advisor and the real architect of the regime's hidden machinery. Nhu controlled the Can Lao Party, a secret political network that spread through every level of government. Military offices, police departments, schools, businesses, newspapers, even religious institutions. Membership was often hidden. Loyalty was bought with favors. Disobedience was punished with fear. Bribery, extortion, and political manipulation became part of daily life. Nothing moved without the approval of the Ngo family. Diem trusted almost no one outside his inner circle. He refused to delegate power. He suspected conspiracies everywhere. And because of that, competence mattered less than loyalty. This poisoned the government from the top down. In the countryside, the problems were even worse. Many local officials sent from Saigon were northerners like Diem himself. Many were Roman Catholics ruling over Buddhist-majority villages. To the villagers, they often felt like outsiders, strangers backed by soldiers. Land reform stalled. Promises of justice disappeared. Corruption spread like disease. Police demanded bribes. Officials stole government supplies. Tax burdens remained heavy. And those who complained were often treated as communist sympathizers. Diem's government was supposed to save the countryside from communism. Instead, in many places, it pushed people toward it. In 1955, Diem had launched a major crackdown against communist organizers in the South. Thousands were arrested. Many were imprisoned without trial. Some simply vanished. At first, the campaign appeared successful. The communist underground was badly disrupted. Its networks were shaken. But repression created something stronger than fear. Hatred. By 1957, violence returned. Quietly at first. Then everywhere. Village chiefs were assassinated. Police officers disappeared. Government tax collectors were found dead. Officials loyal to Saigon began living with constant fear. At night, footsteps outside the house could mean death. A new name spread through the countryside: the Viet Cong. To Saigon, they were terrorists. To Hanoi, they were revolutionaries. To many villagers, they were both feared and respected. At first, the Viet Cong operated like shadows. They used ambushes, booby traps, kidnappings, political intimidation. Their purpose was simple: make government impossible. They did not need to defeat the South Vietnamese army in open battle. They only needed to make the state collapse from within. And increasingly, they were succeeding. Many of those joining them were not even committed communists. Some were farmers angry at corrupt officials. Some were Buddhists alienated by Catholic rule. Some were young men seeking revenge for relatives arrested or beaten by government forces. Communism was not always the reason. Sometimes rage was enough. In Hanoi, communist leaders watched carefully. At first, they had hoped political pressure and elections would reunify Vietnam. But by the late 1950s, that hope was dead. Diem would never allow elections. The Americans would never permit a peaceful communist victory. The decision had to be made. In 1959, the Central Committee of the Vietnamese Communist Party met in Hanoi. Its conclusion was historic. The South would be taken by force. Armed struggle was now official policy. Specially trained Southern cadres who had regrouped to the north after Geneva were prepared for return. These were not ordinary recruits. They were experienced revolutionaries. Many were born in the South. They knew the villages. They knew the people. And now they were sent back with weapons, training, and a mission. Over time, they would become the skeleton of the insurgency. Their route south passed through dense jungle and mountains. A hidden network of paths through Laos and Cambodia. At first, it was little more than jungle trails. But it would grow into one of the most famous supply lines in military history. The Ho Chi Minh Trail. Through it came rifles, mortars, ammunition, medical supplies, political officers, and eventually entire units of North Vietnamese troops. It was not a road. It was an artery. And it kept the war alive. Ironically, many of the weapons used by the Viet Cong came from America itself. Some were captured from South Vietnamese forces. Others were sold by corrupt officers in Diem's own army. American rifles, American machine guns, American mortars, used against the very government America was trying to protect. South Vietnam's military, the ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, looked powerful on paper. It had American training, American equipment, American money. But inside, it was deeply flawed. Promotion often depended on political loyalty or family connections, not skill. Many senior officers were apathetic. Some were incompetent. Some were corrupt. Many were all three. Even worse, Viet Cong agents had penetrated the military structure itself. Drivers, radio operators, clerks, office staff, even senior headquarters positions. Information leaked constantly. Plans were compromised before operations even began. The ARVN was built like a conventional army. Heavy weapons, road-based movement, large visible formations. But the war it faced was not conventional. The enemy moved through swamps, jungles, and villages. It appeared, struck, and disappeared. American advisors assigned to help often barely understood the country they were in. Most did not speak Vietnamese. Many stayed less than a year. They rotated in and out while the war remained constant. They brought doctrine, but not understanding. By the end of 1960, the Communists in the South announced something new. The National Liberation Front. The NLF. To the outside world, it was presented as a broad Southern movement, a coalition of people seeking freedom from Diem's dictatorship. Its message was carefully crafted. It was not openly communist. It spoke of justice, land reform, national liberation, democracy. But behind the language stood Hanoi. The NLF was the political face. The Viet Cong remained a military fist. Its military structure was organized with precision. At the base were village guerrilla units. These were part-time fighters. Farmers by day. Revolutionaries by night. They planted traps. Gathered intelligence. Protected local communist networks. And made sure fear stayed alive. Above them were regional forces, full-time soldiers operating across provinces. Better trained. Better armed. Capable of larger attacks. And above them stood the main force units. Disciplined. Mobile. Professional. These were the units that could challenge ARVN battalions and eventually American troops. Together, they formed what the Communists called the People's Liberation Armed Forces. To the Americans, it was simply the enemy. And by 1960, that enemy was growing fast. VC attacks were averaging more than 100 a month. Government officials were dying by the thousands. In 1 year alone, around 2,500 government functionaries and others considered enemies of the revolution were assassinated. Entire districts slipped from Saigon's control. At night, many villages belonged to the Viet Cong. By day, the government pretended otherwise. The illusion of stability was collapsing. In Saigon and Washington, it took time for leaders to accept the truth. Many still believed Diem could recover. That stronger policing, more advisors, and better weapons would solve the problem. But reality was harder. In January 1960, Viet Cong companies attacked and overran an ARVN regimental headquarters northeast of Saigon. This was no longer scattered terrorism. This was organized insurgency. Americans in Vietnam began demanding stronger action. And in Washington, a new president had just entered the White House. John F. Kennedy. Young. Confident. Determined to prove that America would not retreat before communist expansion. To Kennedy, Vietnam represented both danger and opportunity. Danger, because communist-led insurgencies were spreading across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Opportunity, because Vietnam could become proof that the United States knew how to stop them. This was not the old kind of war. No giant front lines. No clear invasion. This was insurgency. Subversion. Guerrilla warfare. Political warfare. Kennedy believed America needed to master counterinsurgency. Vietnam would become the test. And behind it all stood the domino theory. Lose Vietnam. And the rest of Southeast Asia might follow. Laos. Cambodia. Thailand. Malaysia. Perhaps beyond. The collapse of one country might weaken all the others. And worse, it might convince allies everywhere that American promises meant nothing. Kennedy saw Vietnam not as a remote jungle war, but as a global message. If America failed here, the world would notice. So he chose escalation. Carefully. Gradually. But unmistakably. In 1961, U.S. military advisors increased rapidly. Economic aid surged. American helicopters arrived. Armored personnel carriers. Communications systems. Counterinsurgency experts. Special forces. Strategic planning teams. The United States was no longer simply supporting South Vietnam. It was beginning to shape it. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson visited Saigon in May 1961 to reassure Diem of American commitment. Washington publicly praised the South Vietnamese president. Privately, doubts were growing. Kennedy sent two key advisors to assess the crisis: Walt Rostow and General Maxwell Taylor. Their conclusion was blunt. South Vietnam was losing. And without massive American assistance, it might collapse. They recommended helicopters. More military aid. American advisors placed at every level of government and army. Even limited U.S. combat troops. The Joint Chiefs of Staff supported it. Kennedy hesitated. He feared the political cost of losing another country to communism. But he also feared becoming trapped in a land war in Asia. The memory of Korea still haunted Washington. So he chose the middle path. No combat troops. Not yet. but a huge expansion of American involvement. A new command was created. U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, USMAC. Its mission was to direct and coordinate the growing American effort. The number of U.S. military personnel rose dramatically. From fewer than 800 in the 1950s to around 9,000 by mid-1962. The war was deepening, and America was already inside it. By 1962, America was no longer simply advising South Vietnam. It was helping shape the war itself. Helicopters thundered over rice fields. American advisors moved with South Vietnamese units. Weapons, money, and confidence poured into Saigon. To Washington, it seemed the tide could still be turned. President John F. Kennedy believed that with the right strategy, enough pressure, and stronger leadership, South Vietnam could defeat the insurgency. The key, he believed, was separating the people from the rebels. If the villagers could be protected from the Viet Cong, the rebellion would wither. At least, that was the theory. The answer became known as the Strategic Hamlet Program. It was one of the most ambitious and controversial projects of the early war. The idea was inspired by British success in Malaya during its war against communist insurgents. In Malaya, rural populations had been relocated into fortified, new villages, where they could be protected and monitored. American and South Vietnamese planners believed the same could work in Vietnam. Villagers would be moved into defended settlements. Fences would be built. Watchtowers raised. Militias armed. The countryside would be secured one village at a time. And the Viet Cong would be cut off from food, shelter, recruits, and information. On paper, it looked brilliant. In reality, it became a disaster. Entire families were uprooted from ancestral lands. Farmers were forced to abandon graves, temples, and fields their families had worked for generations. Many were ordered to build the hamlets themselves through unpaid labor. Officials stole construction funds. Corrupt local authorities treated the project like another opportunity for extortion. And worst of all, nobody could reliably tell who supported the government and who secretly supported the Viet Cong. Sometimes the enemy was already inside the walls. Many so-called secure hamlets quickly became infiltrated. Some had as many Viet Cong sympathizers within them as outside. Instead of isolating the insurgency, the program often deepened resentment. To many villagers, the government that claimed to protect them felt more like a prison guard. The Viet Cong exploited that anger perfectly. They whispered, "See, Saigon does not protect you. It controls you." And many listened. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, the Viet Cong were learning quickly. American helicopters gave the ARVN mobility. Armored personnel carriers gave them firepower. But new weapons did not guarantee victory. Helicopters were vulnerable to small arms fire. Machine gunners and exposed drivers on armored vehicles became easy targets. The communists adapted fast. And they were helped by one constant truth. The leadership of the South Vietnamese army remained weak. Many commanders were still chosen for political reliability rather than military skill. Operations were often slow, confused, and badly coordinated. Even when the ARVN had superior numbers and equipment, victory could slip away. Then came a battle that shattered illusions. AP back. January 1963. A small village in the Mekong Delta. What should have been a straightforward government victory became an international embarrassment. A Viet Cong battalion had been located near the village. South Vietnamese forces, supported by American advisors, helicopters, armored vehicles, and artillery, moved to surround it. The Americans expected a decisive win. Instead, they watched failure unfold. ARVN commanders hesitated. Orders were delayed. Attacks were poorly coordinated. The Viet Cong, though outnumbered and surrounded, held their ground. They shot down helicopters, disabled armored carriers, killed around 80 South Vietnamese soldiers, and 3 American advisors. Then, despite being trapped, they fought their way out. The battle was a humiliation. For the first time, aggressive American journalists on the ground began openly questioning official claims that the war was being won. Some U.S. advisors privately agreed. But in Saigon, there was a powerful bureaucracy built on optimism. The commander of U.S. forces, General Paul Harkins, and U.S. Ambassador Frederick Knowlton continued reassuring Washington that progress was being made. The numbers looked good. Reports sounded positive. But reality in the villages said otherwise. And by the summer of 1963, something even more dangerous was happening. The Diem regime itself was beginning to collapse from within. The Ngo family had always been controversial. Now they were becoming toxic. Ngo Dinh Nhu, Diem's brother, was widely known for his secret police network and his obsession with political control. Rumors spread that he secretly negotiated with North Vietnam. American intelligence watched him closely. But perhaps even more damaging was his wife, Madame Nhu. Sharp-tongued, politically ambitious, and openly contemptuous of the Buddhist majority, she became one of the most hated figures in South Vietnam. While much of the country was Buddhist, the Ngo family ruled through a Catholic elite. Religious tensions had existed for years. Now they exploded. In May 1963, government restrictions on Buddhist religious displays triggered protests in the city of Hue. Security forces opened fire. People were killed. The Buddhist crisis had begun. Demonstrations spread. Monks marched. Students joined them. Professional classes in Saigon began openly criticizing the regime. Instead of compromise, the government responded with repression. Pagodas were raided. Monks were arrested. Protesters were beaten. The crisis deepened. Then came one of the most shocking images of the 20th century. June 11, 1963. Saigon. At a busy intersection, a Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc calmly sat down in the lotus position. He was protesting Diem's persecution of Buddhists. Another monk poured gasoline over him. Without panic, without hesitation, he struck a match. Flames consumed him. Witnesses watched in horror. He did not scream. He did not move. He simply burned. Journalists photographed everything. The next morning, the images were on front pages around the world. President Kennedy reportedly said no news picture in history had generated so much emotion. Suddenly, the American public could see what kind of regime the United States was defending. And Madame Nhu made it worse. Instead of sympathy, she mocked the death, calling it a barbecue. Her cruelty shocked even Diem's supporters. In Washington, patience was breaking. Many American officials had tolerated Diem because they believed there was no alternative. Now they began to wonder if he had become the problem itself. The Buddhists were no longer alone. Students, civil servants, military officers, even some within the regime had turned against him. After further brutal raids on Buddhist pagodas in August, a group of South Vietnamese generals quietly contacted the United States. They wanted to know one thing. If they moved against Diem, would Washington stop them? The answer was carefully worded, but unmistakable. America would not save him. Officially, the U.S. Embassy remained neutral. Unofficially, it maintained contact with the plotting generals. No move was made to protect the Ngo family. By November 1963, the generals were ready. On November 1st, ARVN units moved through Saigon. They seized key buildings. They disarmed Ngu's security forces. They surrounded the presidential palace. Diem and Nhu escaped through secret tunnels. For a moment, it seemed they might survive. But they were found. Captured. And on November 2nd, both brothers were murdered in the back of an armored personnel carrier. Their death shocked many, including some Americans who had supported the coup. The United States had helped remove its own ally. But the question remained. What now? Many in Washington believed Diem's removal would create unity and stronger leadership. Instead, it created chaos. Governments rose and fell rapidly. Military juntas formed and collapsed. Personal ambition replaced national strategy. Stability did not come. It disappeared. And before America could fully absorb the consequences, another assassination changed history. November 22, 1963. Dallas, Texas. President Kennedy was shot and killed. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson became president. And with him, Vietnam entered a new era. Johnson inherited a war he had not chosen. Unlike Kennedy, he did not find Vietnam exciting. He saw it as a dangerous distraction from what he truly wanted. His domestic revolution. Civil rights. Education. Healthcare. The Great Society. He wanted to transform America at home. Not fight a jungle war abroad. But politically, Vietnam was a trap. Johnson understood the danger of being the president who lost another country to communism. China had already fallen. Cuba had become communist. If South Vietnam collapsed under his watch, the political consequences in Washington could be devastating. He also believed deeply in American credibility. If the United States abandoned South Vietnam, what would allies around the world think? Would NATO trust Washington? Would Asia trust its promises? Would enemies see weakness? Johnson did not want war. But he feared defeat even more. So he chose continuity. And then escalation. He replaced General Paul Harkins with a new commander. General William Westmoreland. Young, confident, disciplined, and respected. Westmoreland would become the face of America's military effort in Vietnam. Johnson also increased American military personnel again. At the time of Kennedy's death, around 16,000 U.S. personnel were in Vietnam. By the end of 1964, that number would rise to around 23,000. Still officially advisors. But the line between advisor and combatant was disappearing. And while Washington struggled with political instability in Saigon, Hanoi reached its own conclusion. Victory might be closer than ever. The South Vietnamese government looked weak. Its leadership divided. Its army vulnerable. The Americans still had not committed full combat forces. Now was the moment to strike harder. North Vietnam decided to increase its direct military commitment. Not just weapons. Not just advisors. Troops. Regular units of the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, began moving south through Laos along the growing network of jungle roads known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was no longer just an insurgency. The war was becoming something much larger. And both sides were preparing for the moment when there would be no turning back. By the end of 1963, Vietnam was no longer a limited advisory mission. It was becoming a full-scale confrontation. In Saigon, governments rose and fell with alarming speed. Generals plotted against generals. Military juntas replaced civilian authority. Promises of stability disappeared almost as quickly as they were made. After Dien's death, many in Washington had believed South Vietnam would finally unite against the communist threat. Instead, the country sank deeper into political confusion. The first military junta that replaced Dien was weak and short-lived. By January 1964, General Nguyen Con seized power in yet another coup. But even Con could not restore real control. The South Vietnamese state looked increasingly fragile. And in Hanoi, communist leaders were watching carefully. To them, the chaos in Saigon looked like opportunity. For years, the war in the South had been fought mainly through the Viet Cong insurgency. Now North Vietnam believed the time had come for something bigger. Victory no longer seemed distant. It seemed possible. The decision was made to increase direct military involvement. Regular units of the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, would move south. Not just cadres. Not just weapons. Entire combat formations. Thousands of troops began moving through Laos along the expanding Ho Chi Minh Trail. What had once been hidden jungle footpaths was becoming a complex military supply network. Roads were improved. Truck routes expanded. Bridges were built and rebuilt. Men, ammunition, mortars, machine guns, and artillery all moved south through the jungle. The trail became the lifeline of the communist war effort. Destroying it would prove almost impossible. North Vietnam was not fighting alone. Chinese leader Mao Zedong strongly supported Hanoi. China promised weapons, engineering support, and logistics. At the same time, the Soviet Union, despite its growing rivalry with China, also committed major aid. Both communist giants wanted influence in Hanoi. Both wanted to prove their commitment to the revolutionary struggle. Weapons poured in. Anti-aircraft systems. Fuel. Trucks. Ammunition. Advisors. North Vietnam was becoming stronger, and South Vietnam was becoming weaker. To many American officials, it seemed there was only one remaining option: strike the North directly. Until now, the United States had focused mainly on helping South Vietnam defend itself. But with Saigon unstable and communist forces expanding, many in Washington argued that the source of the problem lay in Hanoi. If North Vietnam paid a heavy enough price for supporting the war in the South, perhaps it would stop. Quietly, American planners had already begun testing the idea. Small maritime raids were launched by South Vietnamese forces against North Vietnamese coastal targets. Agents were parachuted into the north. Saboteurs attempted limited operations. Most achieved little. Some ended in disaster. But they revealed a growing shift in thinking. The war might not be won only in the South. Pressure had to be applied to the North. By the summer of 1964, the Pentagon had developed plans for airstrikes against selected targets in North Vietnam. The goal was not immediate destruction. It was pain, pressure, punishment. Enough to force Hanoi to reconsider. Some of President Lyndon B. Johnson's advisors wanted him to seek formal congressional approval for broader military action. A resolution could grant him sweeping authority to defend U.S. interests in Southeast Asia. Johnson hesitated. 1964 was an election year. He did not want Vietnam dominating the campaign. He preferred to delay the issue until after November. But history rarely waits for political convenience. In August 1964, an incident in dark waters would change everything. The Gulf of Tonkin. The USS Maddox was an American destroyer conducting electronic surveillance patrols near the coast of North Vietnam. Officially, it was a routine intelligence mission. In reality, it operated in the shadow of covert South Vietnamese raids against North Vietnamese coastal islands. Just one day before the crisis, South Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked the islands of Han My and Han Nui. The North Vietnamese knew something was happening, and they suspected the Maddox was involved. On August 2nd, North Vietnamese torpedo boats approached the destroyer. Tension exploded. Shots were fired. The Maddox opened fire. Aircraft from a nearby U.S. carrier joined the fight. The North Vietnamese boats were driven off. The Maddox suffered no serious damage. The first attack was real. President Johnson responded quickly. He announced that U.S. Navy patrols would continue, and he sent a second destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, to join the Maddox. Washington wanted to show strength. But 2 nights later, on August 4th, came the moment that would reshape the war. The 2 destroyers reported another attack. Radar contacts. Torpedo warnings. Confused messages in darkness and bad weather. Sailors believed enemy boats were closing in. Weapons were fired. Alarms spread through command channels. Back in Washington, the news was treated as a second deliberate North Vietnamese attack on American ships. But almost immediately doubts appeared. The captain of the Maddox himself warned that the evidence was uncertain. Some reports suggested the ships may have been firing at false radar signals, rough seas, or their own nervous interpretations. There may have been no second attack at all. But in the White House, uncertainty became certainty. Johnson and his advisors chose to believe the attack had happened. Or perhaps more accurately, they chose not to question it. The president ordered retaliatory airstrikes against North Vietnamese naval bases. And more importantly, he went to Congress. He asked for support. Not for a declaration of war. Something broader. A resolution that would allow him to take whatever action he deemed necessary to protect American forces and allies in Southeast Asia. It became known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. On August 7, 1964, it passed overwhelmingly in both the Senate and the House. Only 2 senators voted against it. Most lawmakers knew little about the doubts surrounding the second attack. Even fewer knew about the covert South Vietnamese operations linked to the events. The resolution gave Johnson extraordinary power. Without formally declaring war, Congress had handed the president authority to wage one. It was the blank check. The legal foundation for America's full-scale military intervention in Vietnam. And politically, it removed Vietnam as a threat to Johnson's election campaign. In November 1964, he won by a landslide. But between the Gulf of Tonkin and the election, the situation in Vietnam continued to deteriorate. In Saigon, government instability became almost absurd. Coalitions collapsed in weeks. Power shifted constantly. The ARVN remained unable to decisively defeat the Viet Cong. Even elite units struggled. In the countryside, communist influence kept growing. And the Viet Cong had begun deliberately targeting American personnel and bases. In November 1964, they launched a devastating mortar attack on the U.S. air base at Dien Hoa near Saigon. Americans were killed. Aircraft were destroyed. The message was clear. The United States was no longer just an advisor. It was now a direct target. Inside Johnson's administration, pressure intensified. Many of his senior advisors argued that stronger retaliation against the North was now unavoidable. Bombing North Vietnam, they said, would do three things. First, it would reassure the unstable South Vietnamese leadership that America remained committed. Second, it would raise morale among South Vietnamese forces. Third, it would force Hanoi to pay a price for supporting the war. Maybe it would even reduce the flow of troops and supplies moving south. Almost all of Johnson's senior civilian and military advisors supported bombing. They disagreed only on method. The military preferred a short, overwhelming campaign designed to cripple North Vietnam's war-making capacity quickly. Others, like National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy and Assistant Secretary of Defense John McNaughton, argued for gradual escalation. Bomb step by step. Increase the pain slowly. Let Hanoi decide the cost was too high. There were warnings. Under-Secretary of State George Ball believed bombing would only drag America deeper into the war. Vice President Hubert Humphrey feared political disaster at home. Both warned Johnson that airstrikes might not end the war. They might only begin America's real commitment. But Johnson was less focused on long-term theory. He saw the immediate crisis. Saigon was slipping. The war looked unwinnable without action. And politically, doing nothing looked like surrender. So in February 1965, the United States crossed another line. Without major public announcement, sustained bombing of North Vietnam began. Its code name: Operation Rolling Thunder. At first, the attacks were limited. Carefully chosen targets. Bridges. Supply depots. Transportation routes. Military facilities. The White House tightly controlled the bombing list. Johnson wanted pressure. But not a wider war with China or the Soviet Union. Ports with Soviet ships were avoided. Targets near the Chinese border were handled cautiously. Everything was measured. Everything was political. But very quickly it became clear that bombing alone would not solve the problem. North Vietnam did not collapse. Its leaders did not panic. Instead, they adapted. And in the South, Communist forces continued advancing. By mid-March 1965, General William Westmoreland and the Joint Chiefs of Staff reached a blunt conclusion. If the United States truly wanted to prevent Communist victory, bombs would not be enough. American combat troops would be necessary. For years, U.S. presidents had tried to avoid exactly this decision. The memory of Korea haunted Washington. A costly Asian land war with no clear end. President Johnson understood the danger. He did not want American boys fighting and dying in the jungles of Southeast Asia. But now the choice looked simple. Commit troops. Or watch South Vietnam collapse. And for Johnson, defeat was politically and strategically unacceptable. The war was about to change forever. The war was about to change forever. For years, The United States had tried to fight in Vietnam without calling it an American war. There were advisors. There was money. There were helicopters, intelligence officers, military planners, and quiet funerals. But officially, it was still South Vietnam's war. America was only helping. That illusion ended in 1965. Because bombing North Vietnam was not enough. Operation Rolling Thunder had begun with the belief that pain from the sky would force Hanoi to stop supporting the insurgency in the south. Instead, the bombs fell. And the war continued. North Vietnam did not break. It endured. Aid from the Soviet Union and China continued flowing. The Ho Chi Minh Trail kept moving men and weapons south. And in the villages of South Vietnam, the Viet Cong remained strong. General William Westmoreland now faced a brutal reality. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, could not win alone. In fact, it might collapse. South Vietnamese forces were exhausted, politically divided, and increasingly unable to stop Communist main force units. Westmoreland warned Washington that without immediate reinforcement, the war could be lost. He was not asking for more advisors. He was asking for American soldiers. Real combat troops. Men who would not simply train South Vietnamese units, but fight in their place. President Lyndon B. Johnson understood what that meant. This would no longer be limited involvement. It would be war. And war in Asia carried ghosts. The Korean War still haunted every major decision in Washington. Thousands dead. Years of bloody stalemate. No clear victory. Johnson feared another Korea. But he feared something else even more. Being the president who lost Vietnam. His domestic agenda, the Great Society, civil rights reform, education, healthcare, depended on political strength. A communist victory in Vietnam could destroy everything. He believed retreat would be seen not as realism, but as weakness. And weakness, in Cold War politics, could be fatal. So he made the decision. Quietly. Without a dramatic declaration. Without asking Congress for war. In July 1965, Johnson authorized the dispatch of 100,000 U.S. troops immediately. Another 100,000 would follow. There was no formal declaration of war. No national emergency. No mass mobilization. The National Guard was not called. The reserves were not fully activated. America entered full-scale war through policy papers and press conferences. At the end of July, Johnson announced the decision almost calmly. But history had shifted. The United States was now fully committed. And there would be no easy exit. As American troops poured into Vietnam, they entered a country already shaped by years of invisible war. They arrived not to begin a conflict, but to inherit one. And they brought with them an industrial military machine unlike anything Vietnam had ever seen. To support the growing American force, an enormous logistical empire had to be built almost from nothing. New ports, massive air bases, runways capable of handling heavy jets, warehouses stretching across thousands of square meters, hospitals, fuel depots, road systems. Entire American cities rose from jungle and mud. By the end of the buildup, the United States had constructed 4 major jet-capable air bases with 10,000-foot runways, 6 deep-water ports, 75 tactical air bases, 26 hospitals, and more than 10 million square feet of warehousing. Vietnam was becoming not just a battlefield, but a machine of war. And the soldiers arriving there were entering a conflict unlike any they had trained for. Many were young. 19, 20, 21. Some volunteered. Many were drafted. Most knew little about Vietnam. They knew the names, communism, domino theory, freedom. But they did not know the villages. They did not know the language. They did not know the jungle. They would learn quickly. Or they would die. The first major American combat troops to land were U.S. Marines at Da Nang in March 1965. Officially, they were there to defend the air base. In reality, everyone understood the truth. America had crossed the line. Photographs of Marines stepping onto Vietnamese beaches would become iconic. At first, many Americans still believed the war could be won quickly. Superior firepower, superior training, superior technology. The world's strongest military against guerrillas in sandals. Surely victory was only a matter of time. But the enemy was not fighting the kind of war America expected. General Westmoreland developed the strategy that would define the U.S. war effort. Attrition. His logic was simple. The United States possessed overwhelming firepower. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese did not. If American troops could find and destroy enough enemy units, if communist casualties became high enough, eventually Hanoi would run out of men, morale, or will. The war would be won not by territory, but by exhaustion. This became known through one infamous phrase: search and destroy. American forces would move aggressively into jungles, mountains, and remote base areas to locate enemy units. Once found, they would unleash overwhelming firepower. Artillery, helicopter gunships, fighter aircraft, and even B-52 strategic bombers. The goal was not necessarily to hold land. It was to kill, to grind the enemy down. Behind this American shield, Westmoreland believed the South Vietnamese government could restore control of villages and rebuild political authority. The Americans would break the enemy's main forces. The ARVN would secure the countryside. At least, that was the theory. But war in Vietnam refused to obey theory. The first major test came in late 1965. The Ai Drang Valley, deep in the Central Highlands near the Cambodian border. It was here that American troops would meet large formations of the North Vietnamese army in direct battle for the first time. And both sides would learn what kind of war this would be. The battle began in November. U.S. forces using helicopters were inserted into landing zone X-ray, a clearing surrounded by jungle. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore and his men expected contact. They did not expect what came next. They had landed in the path of major North Vietnamese forces. Thousands of enemy soldiers were nearby. Almost immediately, the Americans were attacked. Wave after wave of North Vietnamese troops charged through elephant grass and jungle. The fighting became desperate, close, brutal. At times, hand-to-hand. American artillery pounded enemy positions so close that friendly fire seemed almost inevitable. Airstrikes crashed into the tree lines. Helicopters fought to bring ammunition in and carry the wounded out. Men died where they stood. The battle lasted for days. When it ended, the Americans held the field. North Vietnamese casualties were enormous. But so were the lessons. To the Americans, Ai Drang proved that superior firepower could survive even the fiercest assault. To the North Vietnamese, it proved something else. If they fought close enough, if they grabbed the Americans by the belt, they could reduce the impact of U.S. artillery and air power. It also proved that the Americans had come to stay. This was no longer a proxy war. It was now a direct fight between the United States and North Vietnam. Both sides left Ai Drang believing they had learned how to win. Both were wrong. As 1965 turned into 1966, the war expanded rapidly. More troops arrived. More operations were launched. More villages were caught between armies. American commanders focused on large enemy units in jungles and mountains. South Vietnamese forces were expected to handle local security and pacification. But the line between battlefield and civilian life barely existed. The enemy did not wear uniforms. The battlefield had no front. A farmer by day could be a guerrilla by night. A child could carry messages. A village elder could guide troops, or betray them. Trust became impossible. And fear became routine. Because progress in an attrition war had to be measured somehow, the U.S. military leaned heavily on one brutal statistic: body count. Enemy dead became the language of success. How many killed? How many confirmed? How many estimated? Promotion, reports, and optimism often depended on those numbers. And numbers began to lie. Commanders inflated results. Civilian deaths were sometimes counted as enemy fighters. Victories were reported where confusion ruled. The war became a mathematics of death. But the enemy had a vote. North Vietnam did not seem close to breaking. Its manpower remained vast. Losses were terrible, but replaceable. And whenever pressure became too intense, communist forces could withdraw across borders into Laos, Cambodia, or back into North Vietnam. Hanoi, not Washington, often controlled the tempo of the war. Meanwhile, the bombing of the North intensified. By the end of 1966, the United States had dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than it had dropped on Japan during World War II. More than during the entire Korean War. Yet still, the war continued. North Vietnam was largely agricultural. There were few industrial targets to destroy. Supplies came from China and the Soviet Union. When petroleum depots were destroyed, fuel was dispersed and hidden. Roads were repaired. Bridges rebuilt overnight. Bombs could destroy structures. They could not destroy resolve. And every American aircraft loss meant more prisoners, more funerals, and more questions back home. By the end of 1966, nearly 500 U.S. aircraft had already been lost over North Vietnam. Pilots disappeared into prison camps. Families waited for news that often never came. Still, Washington insisted progress was being made. Still, troop numbers increased. By 1966 and into 1967, the war had become fully American. More than 500,000 U.S. military personnel would eventually be stationed in Vietnam. The conflict that began as a colonial war had become America's war. And yet, despite all the firepower, all the helicopters, all the bombs, victory remained distant. Because Vietnam was not only a military war. It was a political war. And in that war, firepower alone could not save them. By 1966, America was fighting the largest war it had entered since World War II. More than 500,000 U.S. troops would eventually serve in Vietnam. Jets screamed across the skies. B-52 bombers shook the earth. Helicopters became the symbol of the war itself, arriving suddenly, vanishing just as fast, carrying soldiers into battles no one could fully understand. From Washington, it looked like overwhelming power. From the ground, it often felt like confusion. General William Westmoreland believed the strategy was working. Attrition. Search and destroy. Kill enough enemy soldiers, and eventually the communist war machine would collapse. It sounded logical. But Vietnam was not a conventional battlefield. The Americans could win every major battle and still lose the war. Because once U.S. forces left an area, the Viet Cong often returned. A village, secured, 1 week could be under communist influence the next. The jungle absorbed armies. Victory vanished into the trees. Still, operations grew larger. In the provinces north and east of Saigon, the United States launched massive offensives with names like Cedar Falls and Junction City. Thousands of troops moved through suspected communist strongholds. Helicopters filled the skies. Fighter bombers screamed overhead. Artillery pounded tree lines for hours. Entire forests shook under the weight of American firepower. The goal was to destroy communist base areas, supply caches, and command centers. Sometimes they found them. Huge stores of weapons. Rice stockpiles. Underground tunnel systems. Documents. Medical stations. Proof that the enemy had been there. But after every operation came the same problem. The Americans would leave. And the enemy would return. The jungle did not belong to the strongest army. It belonged to the side willing to live inside it forever. This frustration pushed American commanders toward even harsher measures. If the forests protected the enemy, remove the forests. If villages fed the enemy, control the villages. If crops sustained guerrillas, destroy the crops. One of the most controversial tools of the war became a chemical called Agent Orange. It was a herbicide. Its purpose was simple. Kill vegetation. Aircraft sprayed millions of gallons across forests near the borders of Laos and Cambodia, northwest of Saigon, and along major waterways. Dense jungle cover disappeared. Leaves died. Trees blackened. The hidden paths of the Ho Chi Minh Trail became more exposed. At least temporarily. But the cost was devastating. Agent Orange did not only kill plants. It poisoned land. It entered rivers. It touched civilians. It touched American soldiers. Years later, thousands would suffer cancers, birth defects, and illnesses linked to that chemical. The war did not end when the shooting stopped. For many, it continued in hospitals and graves decades later. Meanwhile, along the demilitarized zone, the DMZ separating North and South Vietnam, the Americans tried to build a wall against infiltration. A chain of fortified bases stretched from the South China Sea westward toward Laos, Con Tien, Gio Lin, Camp Carroll, and one name that would become legendary, Khe Sanh. These outposts were part of a larger barrier system. Minefields, electronic sensors, infrared detectors, listening devices. The idea was to stop North Vietnamese infiltration from the north, to create a shield. But the North Vietnamese saw something else. They saw fixed targets, American bases within artillery range, and they attacked them relentlessly. Shells rained down on outposts. Mortars struck bunkers. Supply convoys were ambushed. The DMZ became one of the deadliest stretches of land in the war. At Khe Sanh, the sense of isolation was constant. A marine base near the Laotian border, surrounded by hills and vulnerable to siege. It reminded many officers of another name that haunted military history. Dien Bien Phu, the French fortress where colonial rule had died. No American commander wanted Vietnam's Dien Bien Phu, and yet the fear lingered. Still, the largest battles were not always the most important. Most combat in Vietnam was not giant offensives. It was small, fast, terrifying. A patrol walking into an ambush. A booby trap hidden beneath leaves. A sniper shot from a tree line. A village raid at midnight. A mine exploding beneath a convo. Most firefights lasted minutes. Sometimes seconds. But they could leave bodies everywhere. The enemy rarely stayed long enough for decisive victory. They struck, then vanished. The war became psychological. Sleep was uncertain. Trust was impossible. Even silence felt dangerous. And while American casualties mounted, something else was happening thousands of miles away. The war was coming home. Television brought Vietnam into American living rooms in a way no previous war had. Families watched helicopters lifting wounded soldiers, burning villages, body bags, children running through smoke. The brutality was no longer hidden in distant newspaper reports. It arrived every evening with dinner. At first, many Americans believed the sacrifices were necessary. But as 1966 turned into 1967, doubt began to spread. If the United States was winning, why did victory feel so far away? If the enemy was being destroyed, why were more troops always needed? If the war was under control, why were funerals becoming so common? General Westmoreland and military leaders continued speaking confidently. Progress was being made. Enemy body counts were high. Communist forces were suffering. Victory, they suggested, was visible on the horizon. But many soldiers returning home told a different story. And journalists on the ground were becoming harder to convince. One military study called PROM, Program for the Pacification and Long-Term Development of Vietnam, quietly challenged Westmoreland's entire strategy. Its conclusion was uncomfortable. Attrition would not work. The war could not be won simply by killing enemy troops. Real victory required security for rural populations. Stability. Political legitimacy. Trust. Without that, military victories meant little. The report argued America should focus less on search and destroy missions and more on protecting villages and building local control. But its recommendations were largely ignored. Big battles looked like progress. Pacification looked slow, uncertain, and politically unrewarding. So the war continued the same way. More sweeps. More bombing. More body counts. And still, Hanoi did not break. North Vietnam endured astonishing punishment. By the end of 1966, the bombing campaign had become immense. Yet the communist leadership remained determined. China and the Soviet Union kept supplying aid. Anti-aircraft defenses grew stronger. Surface-to-air missiles. Radar systems. Modern fighter jets. Every raid became more dangerous. American pilots faced skies filled with fire. Some never returned. By now, nearly 500 U.S. aircraft had been lost over the north. Hundreds of airmen were dead or prisoners of war. Still, the White House pressed on. Because stopping looked like weakness. And escalation had become its own trap. In America, opposition was no longer limited to a few intellectuals or students. Campus protests spread. Clergy spoke against the war. Professors questioned official claims. Civil rights leaders began linking racial injustice at home to war abroad. Young protesters marched outside the White House shouting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" In October 1967, tens of thousands of demonstrators gathered outside the Pentagon. Some came out of moral outrage. They saw villages destroyed, civilians dying, and a corrupt South Vietnamese government being defended in the name of freedom. Others opposed the war for simpler reasons. Too many Americans were dying. Too much money was being spent. And there was still no victory. But there were also those who believed the opposite. That Johnson was not fighting hard enough. That the military had one hand tied behind its back. That restrictions on bombing and fears of Chinese or Soviet escalation were preventing total victory. Vietnam divided America in every direction. Not just politically. Emotionally. Families argued. Campuses exploded. Trust in government weakened. By the summer of 1967, fewer than half of Americans approved of Johnson's handling of the war. In Hanoi, communist leaders watched all of this closely. They saw something important. America was stronger militarily. But politically it was vulnerable. The war was not only being fought in jungles and rice fields. It was being fought in American public opinion. And if that could be broken, the war itself could be broken. The North Vietnamese leadership decided it was time for a gamble so bold it could change everything. A nationwide offensive. Simultaneous attacks across South Vietnam. Cities. Towns. Military bases. Government centers. And if possible, a popular uprising. They called it the General Offensive and General Uprising. It would come during Tet, the Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in Vietnam, a time when many expected peace, a time when many soldiers relaxed, a time when no one expected hell. And in early 1968, hell was exactly what arrived. By the beginning of 1968, American leaders believed they were close to breaking the enemy. General William Westmoreland spoke confidently of progress. Enemy casualties were rising. Communist supply lines were under constant attack. More than 500,000 American troops were now in Vietnam. From Washington to Saigon, the official message was clear. Victory was visible. The enemy was weakening. The end was approaching. But in Hanoi, a very different decision had already been made. North Vietnamese leaders understood they could not match American firepower. They could not outbomb the bombers. They could not outproduce the factories of the United States. But they believed they could do something else. They could break American will. If the people of the United States stopped believing in victory, the war would collapse from inside Washington itself. To do that, they needed a shock. Something so large, so unexpected, so psychologically devastating that it would destroy the illusion of progress. The plan was breathtaking in scale. Simultaneous attacks across South Vietnam. Cities. Provincial capitals. District towns. Military bases. Airfields. Even the heart of Saigon itself. And if possible, a mass uprising by the South Vietnamese people against their own government. The operation would strike during Tet, the Lunar New Year festival. Tet was the most important holiday in Vietnam. Families traveled home. Soldiers often relaxed. Temporary ceasefires were common. It was a season of ritual, ancestors, and peace. That was exactly why it was chosen. To prepare, Communist forces launched diversionary attacks. In late 1967 they struck at Dak Tu in the Central Highlands, and at Loc Ninh on the road to Saigon. These battles drew American attention away from the cities. Then came the final distraction. Khe Sanh. Near the Laotian border, close to the DMZ, sat the isolated U.S. Marine base. Beginning in January 1968, North Vietnamese divisions surrounded it. Heavy artillery pounded the base. Shells crashed into bunkers. Runways were hit. Supplies became dangerous to deliver. Journalists immediately compared it to Dien Bien Phu, the French fortress destroyed in 1954. The fear was obvious. Was Khe Sanh about to become America's Dien Bien Phu? President Lyndon B. Johnson became obsessed with the base. General Westmoreland believed Khe Sanh was the enemy's main target. Troops were shifted. Attention focused north. But Khe Sanh was not the main event. It was bait. The real blow was coming elsewhere. And on January 31, 1968, it arrived. While nearly 50,000 American and South Vietnamese troops were occupied defending Khe Sanh and the northern frontier, Communist forces launched attacks across the country. The scale was staggering. They struck 36 of 44 provincial capitals, 64 district capitals, 5 of the 6 major cities, dozens of military installations, airfields, government compounds, police headquarters, even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The war had exploded into places where Americans believed it was under control. In Saigon itself, chaos erupted before dawn. A Viet Cong assault team blasted through the walls of the American embassy compound. For hours, confusion spread through military and media channels. Though the attackers never entered the main embassy building and were eventually killed, the image was already immortal. The enemy had reached the symbol of American power. For many watching television back home, it looked like proof that nowhere was safe. In the old imperial city of Hue, the attack was even more dramatic. Communist forces seized control of much of the city. They raised their flags over government buildings. For nearly 3 weeks, fierce urban combat raged street by street, house by house, temple by temple. Hue became one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. Ancient walls shattered. Historic buildings burned. Civilians were trapped between armies. And after Communist forces were pushed out, mass graves were discovered. Thousands of civilians, officials, teachers, suspected government supporters, had been executed. The brutality shocked everyone. Across South Vietnam, surprise gave the Communists early momentum. But the expected popular uprising never came. The South Vietnamese people did not rise en masse to join them. In many places, civilians fought to defend their own neighborhoods. ARVN troops, often underestimated by American commanders, fought with surprising determination, especially when defending their own homes and families. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces recovered quickly. With overwhelming firepower, they struck back. The attackers were hunted down. Most cities were retaken within days. Outside Hue, Communist forces were unable to hold major urban positions for long. Militarily, Tet was devastating for the Viet Cong. Their losses were enormous. Some of their best units were shattered. The uprising they had hoped for never happened. On paper, it looked like an American and South Vietnamese victory. But wars are not fought only on paper. And Tet would become one of the greatest political defeats in American history. Because what Americans saw was not victory. They saw flames in Saigon, gunfire inside the embassy compound, street executions, ruined cities, television crews broadcasting war from places the government had said were secure. For years, officials had spoken of progress, of body counts, of light at the end of the tunnel. Tet shattered that trust. If victory was near, How could the enemy launch attacks everywhere at once? If the enemy was broken, how had they reached the embassy? If the war was under control, why did the country look like it was collapsing? Television transformed perception. Images became more powerful than military reports. One image in particular burned into the American mind. A South Vietnamese police chief executing a Viet Cong prisoner with a pistol shot to the head on a Saigon street. Captured on camera. Broadcast across the world. Brutal. Immediate. Impossible to explain away. The war was now in America's living room. And public confidence cracked. Even respected voices inside the establishment turned. Veteran journalist Walter Cronkite, often called the most trusted man in America, visited Vietnam after Tet. When he returned, his conclusions stunned the nation. The war, he said, seemed mired in stalemate. If Cronkite had lost faith, millions of Americans did too. President Johnson reportedly told aides, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Criticism exploded. Political leaders attacked the administration. Media scrutiny intensified. Students marched. Veterans questioned the purpose. Families with sons in uniform demanded answers. And then came another shock. In March 1968, the New York Times reported that General Westmoreland had requested 206,000 additional troops for Vietnam. To the public, it sounded like confirmation of disaster. If America needed 200,000 more men, then victory was clearly nowhere near. In truth, Westmoreland believed Tet had weakened the enemy so badly that one final massive reinforcement could deliver a knockout blow. The Joint Chiefs of Staff supported him. Some even saw it as an opportunity to finally mobilize reserves and prepare for wider military options. But politically, the request was explosive. Johnson handed the issue to his new Secretary of Defense, Clark Clifford, who had replaced the increasingly disillusioned Robert McNamara. Clifford studied the war, and his conclusion was blunt. Sending more troops would not solve the problem. The entire strategy had to be reconsidered. For the first time, men at the center of power were openly asking whether the war itself was unwinnable. The shock of Tet did not destroy American military strength. It destroyed certainty. And without certainty, political support began to collapse. President Johnson was exhausted. He faced protests in the streets, doubt inside his own administration, rising casualties, falling approval ratings, and a Democratic Party beginning to fracture around the war. Vietnam had become not just a foreign policy crisis, but a presidency-consuming fire. In Hanoi, they understood something essential. They had lost thousands of fighters. The Viet Cong had been badly damaged. But America had lost something harder to replace: belief. And once belief dies, even the strongest army begins to weaken. The Tet Offensive did not end the war, but it ended the illusion. From that moment forward, the central question was no longer, how do we win Vietnam? It became, how do we leave? After Tet, the war changed. Not because the fighting stopped, but because America itself had changed. For years, President Lyndon B. Johnson had tried to balance two impossible worlds. At home, he dreamed of building the Great Society. Civil rights, education reform, healthcare, the war on poverty. Abroad, he was trapped in the jungles of Vietnam. Every bomb dropped overseas seemed to drain money, trust, and political strength from his domestic revolution. Now, after Tet, the balance collapsed. The war was no longer just a military problem. It was destroying his presidency. Inside the White House, even longtime loyalists were losing confidence. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, once one of the strongest architects of escalation, had already become deeply disillusioned. He quietly concluded that the war could not be won in the way Washington imagined. His replacement, Clark Clifford, reached the same conclusion even faster. The request for 206,000 more troops after Tet forced a brutal question. Would America keep escalating forever? More troops, more bombs, more funerals, and still no victory. Johnson began consulting a group of elder statesmen, men known as the wise men, respected figures of the foreign policy establishment. Many had once supported the war. Now several urged de-escalation. Even the establishment was turning. The political pressure became unbearable. Senator Eugene McCarthy had already entered the Democratic presidential race as an anti-war candidate. When he performed unexpectedly well in the New Hampshire primary, it signaled something dangerous. Johnson was vulnerable. Then Senator Robert F. Kennedy entered the race. Now the war was splitting Johnson's own party in public. The president saw the storm clearly. And on March 31, 1968, he addressed the nation on television. Americans expected another speech about escalation. Another promise of victory. Instead, they heard something else. Johnson announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam. He called for peace negotiations. And then, in one of the most shocking moments in modern American political history, he said, "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." It was over. Vietnam had broken the most powerful office in the world. Johnson would not run again. The war had claimed a presidency. But the war itself continued. In Paris, negotiations began between the United States and North Vietnam. The talks were slow, bitter, and often symbolic rather than productive. Arguments erupted even over the shape of the conference table and what it implied about political legitimacy. Peace was discussed. War continued. On the battlefield, fighting remained savage. The siege of Khe Sanh finally ended in mid-1968. For months, the Marine base had endured artillery bombardment and constant pressure. American commanders had treated it as a symbol of determination. But after the siege was lifted, the base was quietly abandoned. Many asked the obvious question. If Khe Sanh was so important, why was it left behind? The answer reflected a deeper truth of the war. Territory was rarely permanent. Victory was often temporary. And symbolism often mattered more than strategy. Meanwhile, General Westmoreland, the face of the attrition strategy, was replaced. He returned to Washington. General Creighton Abrams took command. Abrams approached the war differently. Less emphasis on giant search-and-destroy sweeps. More focus on pacification, local security, and strengthening South Vietnamese forces. It was not a complete rejection of Westmoreland's strategy. But it was a recognition that body counts alone could not win. Still, the deeper question remained unanswered. How could America leave without appearing to lose? That question would define the next president. In November 1968, Richard Nixon won the presidency. He campaigned on a promise of peace with honor, not surrender, not endless escalation, something in between. He claimed to have a secret plan to end the war. Millions of Americans wanted to believe him. Nixon inherited a nightmare. More than 500,000 U.S. troops were still in Vietnam. The anti-war movement was growing. The country was bitterly divided. And North Vietnam showed no sign of surrender. Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, developed the strategy that would define the next phase of the war. Vietnamization. The idea was simple in theory. Turn the fighting over to South Vietnam. Strengthen the ARVN. Train it. Arm it. Expand it. Let South Vietnamese forces gradually take over combat responsibilities while American troops slowly withdrew. The goal was political as much as military. Reduce U.S. casualties. Calm domestic unrest. Preserve South Vietnam long enough to avoid the image of American defeat. In public, Nixon spoke of withdrawal. And U.S. troop levels slowly began to fall. But privately, he believed pressure on Hanoi had to increase. He did not trust negotiations alone. He wanted leverage. And that meant expanding the war. The enemy's sanctuaries in Laos and Cambodia had always been one of America's greatest frustrations. Communist troops could retreat across borders, reorganize, and strike again. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through Laos. Major Viet Cong and North Vietnamese supply bases existed inside Cambodia. Officially, Cambodia was neutral. In reality, the war had already crossed its borders. Nixon decided to strike those sanctuaries. Secretly at first. In 1969, the United States began a hidden bombing campaign against Cambodia. Massive B-52 strikes hit suspected communist base areas. The American public was not told. Congress was largely bypassed. The war was widening even as the president promised to end it. Then, in 1970, the secrecy ended. U.S. and South Vietnamese forces launched a ground invasion into Cambodia. Nixon defended it as necessary to protect withdrawing American troops. He called it a limited operation. Many Americans saw something else. Expansion. Another war. Another betrayal. The reaction at home was explosive. Protests erupted across the country. Campuses shut down. Students occupied buildings. Demonstrations spread nationwide. Then came one of the darkest domestic moments of the era. May 4, 1970. Kent State University. National Guardsmen confronted student protesters. Tension escalated. Shots were fired. 4 students were killed. 9 were wounded. The photographs became national trauma. Young Americans dying not in Vietnam, but on an American campus. The war had crossed every border. Trust in government shattered further. For many, Cambodia proved Nixon's promise of peace was an illusion. But Nixon had something Johnson never fully possessed: a willingness to absorb public hatred if he believed strategy required it. He believed most Americans, the silent majority, still wanted strength, not surrender. And he used that belief relentlessly. While protests filled streets, diplomacy continued behind closed doors. Henry Kissinger met secretly with North Vietnamese negotiators in Paris. Talks moved slowly. Every concession was painful. Every announcement carefully calculated. Meanwhile, the battlefield remained brutal. In 1971, South Vietnamese forces, with heavy American air support, launched an offensive into Laos to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The operation exposed major weaknesses. ARVN units fought hard in places, but the campaign struggled badly. It became clear that replacing American combat power would not be simple. Vietnamization was necessary. But its success was uncertain. And in Hanoi, leaders remained patient. They understood something Nixon could never fully control: time. America wanted out. North Vietnam only had to survive long enough. The war was no longer about decisive victory. It was about endurance. And endurance favored those willing to suffer longest. The final act was approaching. By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War had become a battle against time. America wanted to leave. North Vietnam wanted to wait. President Richard Nixon spoke of peace with honor. But honor, in war, is often another word for delay. The strategy of Vietnamization was now in full motion. American troop levels were falling. South Vietnamese forces, the ARVN, were expected to stand on their own. Billions of dollars in weapons, aircraft, artillery, and training flowed into Saigon. The Army of South Vietnam became one of the largest and best-equipped forces in the world. On paper, it looked powerful. In reality, its strength remained uncertain. Some units fought bravely. Others remained crippled by corruption, poor leadership, and political favoritism. The same weaknesses that had haunted the war from the beginning had never fully disappeared. And North Vietnam knew it. Hanoi had survived years of bombing, invasion, and unimaginable losses. Its leadership understood one simple truth: America was tired. The anti-war movement had changed U.S. politics. Casualties had broken public patience. Presidents could promise victory, but voters wanted an ending. North Vietnam believed that if they endured long enough, the United States would eventually leave. Then the real war could be finished. In 1972, they decided to test that belief. The Easter Offensive. Unlike Tet, this was not primarily a guerrilla uprising. It was a full conventional invasion. Massive North Vietnamese army formations crossed the DMZ, attacked through Laos and Cambodia, and pushed deep into South Vietnam. Tanks rolled south. Artillery thundered. Entire divisions moved openly. It was the largest communist offensive since the war began. The timing was deliberate. American ground forces had largely withdrawn. Would ARVN hold? Or would South Vietnam collapse the moment U.S. troops were gone? At first, the answer looked terrifying. Several South Vietnamese positions collapsed under the assault. Panic spread. Refugees flooded roads. Entire regions seemed at risk. The image Nixon most feared, the rapid disintegration of South Vietnam, appeared suddenly possible. But this time, the United States responded differently. Not with large new ground deployments, but with air power. Massive air power. American bombers struck with extraordinary force. B-52s pounded advancing North Vietnamese formations. Fighter aircraft attacked supply lines, bridges, railways, and troop concentrations. The mining of Hai Phong Harbor choked North Vietnamese supply routes. Another major bombing campaign, Operation Linebacker, began. Unlike Rolling Thunder years earlier, this campaign was more aggressive and less politically restrained. It was designed not just to signal resolve, but to break momentum. And it worked. ARVN, supported by overwhelming American air power, held. Cities like An Loc and Con Tum survived brutal sieges. The offensive did not destroy South Vietnam, but it proved something critical. Without American air power, survival would be doubtful. Vietnamization had not created true independence. It had created dependence with fewer American bodies. Still, Nixon saw an opportunity. The Easter offensive had been costly for Hanoi. The bombing had shown American strength. And diplomacy in Paris was finally moving. Behind closed doors, Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho edged closer to an agreement. Both sides were exhausted. Both wanted advantage. Neither wanted humiliation. The central problem remained brutally simple. North Vietnam demanded the removal of South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu. The United States wanted to preserve South Vietnam's government long enough to avoid the appearance of surrender. Peace was trapped between pride and reality. Then, in October 1972, Kissinger made a dramatic declaration. Peace is at hand. The phrase spread across headlines. Americans, desperate for closure, wanted to believe it. But the peace was fragile. President Thieu in Saigon felt betrayed. He believed Washington was preparing to abandon him. He resisted key terms. Negotiations stalled. And Nixon, facing political pressure and unwilling to appear weak, chose one final demonstration of force. December 1972. The Christmas bombing. Officially called Operation Linebacker 2. For 11 days, American B-52 bombers struck Hanoi and Hai Phong with immense intensity. It was one of the heaviest aerial bombardments of the entire war. The sky over North Vietnam became fire. Anti-aircraft guns filled the night. Missiles climbed into darkness. B-52s, symbols of American strategic power, fell burning from the sky. Civilians died. Entire neighborhoods were shattered. International criticism was fierce. Many called it brutality. Nixon called it necessity. He believed only overwhelming force would push Hanoi to finalize peace. Whether it changed the negotiations or simply hardened positions remains debated. But in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. Officially, the war for America was ending. The terms were complicated. The United States would withdraw its remaining combat forces. American prisoners of war would be returned. A ceasefire would take effect. North Vietnamese troops already inside South Vietnam, however, would remain. That detail mattered enormously. It meant the war was not truly over. It had only changed form. For the United States, the agreement offered an exit. For North Vietnam, it offered time. For South Vietnam, it was a warning. American combat troops left. POWs returned home to emotional reunions. Television showed smiling faces, flags, and relief. To much of the American public, the war felt finished. But in Vietnam, guns had not truly fallen silent. Fighting continued. Both sides violated the ceasefire almost immediately. Territories shifted. Villages changed hands. The peace existed more on paper than on the battlefield. And now South Vietnam faced its greatest fear: survival without America. President Nguyen Van Thieu still ruled in Saigon, but his position was weaker than ever. He had American weapons, but no guarantee of American rescue. Congress, exhausted by years of war and scandal, was increasingly unwilling to fund endless support. Then came another political earthquake: Watergate. As Nixon's presidency collapsed under scandal, his ability to protect South Vietnam collapsed with it. In August 1974, Richard Nixon resigned, the first U.S. president ever to do so. His successor, Gerald Ford, inherited both the presidency and the ruins of Vietnam policy. But Ford had neither Nixon's political authority nor Congress's trust. The American era of the war was over. Hanoi understood this perfectly. The shield was gone. Now only one final offensive remained. And in the spring of 1975, they would launch it. By 1975, the war had entered its final act. For the United States, Vietnam was supposed to be over. The Paris Peace Accords had been signed. American combat troops were gone. Prisoners of war had returned home. Presidents spoke of closure. The public wanted forgetfulness. But in Vietnam, peace had never truly arrived. It had only been postponed. North Vietnam had signed the agreement, but it had never abandoned its ultimate goal: total reunification under communist rule. South Vietnam still stood. Saigon still flew its own flag. President Nguyen Van Thieu still ruled. But without American troops, and with U.S. political support fading fast, the South was standing on borrowed time. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN, looked powerful on paper. It had tanks, aircraft, artillery, American equipment in enormous quantities. But paper strength is not battlefield strength. Corruption remained deep. Leadership was uneven. Morale was fragile. And the one thing South Vietnam had always depended on most, direct American intervention, was gone. In Washington, there would be no return. Congress had turned against the war. The American people were exhausted. After years of casualties, protests, lies, and political collapse, few wanted to hear the word Vietnam ever again. When South Vietnam asked for more aid, the answer was increasingly silence. Hanoi watched carefully. Its leaders knew the moment had come. Not another limited offensive. Not another test. The final blow. In early 1975, North Vietnam launched what would become the Spring Offensive. At first, it was meant to probe weaknesses. Strike hard. See how the South responded. But the response was worse than expected. It was panic. The first major target was Ban My Thuot, a strategic city in the Central Highlands. When it fell quickly, President Thieu made a disastrous decision. Instead of reinforcing threatened positions, he ordered a large-scale withdrawal from the Central Highlands. It was meant to be strategic. It became catastrophe. Retreat turned into collapse. Roads filled with soldiers, civilians, abandoned vehicles, and terror. Units disintegrated. Orders vanished. Families fled beside tanks. Entire provinces were lost not in battle, but in chaos. The psychological collapse was faster than the military one. Cities that had held for years suddenly fell within days. Hue, Da Nang, one after another. The old imperial capital was abandoned. Da Nang, South Vietnam's second-largest city, descended into scenes of desperation as civilians and soldiers fought for escape. Planes overloaded. Ships overcrowded. Families separated forever on crowded docks. What had taken years to defend was collapsing in weeks. North Vietnamese commanders could hardly believe the speed. The offensive accelerated. What began as pressure became a race to Saigon. By April, the capital itself stood exposed. The final destination of 3 decades of war. Saigon. the city where French colonialism had once ruled, where American embassies had promised victory, where presidents and generals had sworn communism would never triumph. Now the war was coming for it. President Thieu, increasingly isolated and furious, accused the United States of betrayal. He was not entirely wrong. America had promised protection, but promises had expired. In April 1975, he resigned and fled. His final speeches were filled with bitterness. South Vietnam was running out of leaders, out of allies, and out of time. As North Vietnamese forces closed in, panic spread through Saigon. Foreign diplomats burned documents. South Vietnamese officials searched desperately for escape routes. Families who had worked with Americans feared execution or imprisonment. The U.S. Embassy became the center of desperation. Thousands gathered outside its gates. People climbed walls, begged soldiers, cried, shouted. Everyone wanted one thing: a way out. The United States launched Operation Frequent Wind. The final evacuation. Helicopters became the last bridge between two collapsing worlds. American personnel, embassy staff, journalists, intelligence officers, and selected South Vietnamese allies were airlifted from rooftops as artillery thundered closer. The image would become one of the most famous of the 20th century. A helicopter on a rooftop. Desperate civilians climbing a ladder. An empire leaving through the sky. For many Americans, it felt like humiliation. For many Vietnamese, it was survival, or abandonment. Not everyone could leave. Far from it. Thousands who had trusted American promises were left behind. Some would face prison camps. Some re-education. Some exile by sea in the years to come. The helicopters kept lifting. But they could never carry everyone. On April 30, 1975, the end arrived. North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the streets of Saigon. One crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. Soldiers rushed inside. The government of South Vietnam surrendered. The war was over. After nearly 20 years of American involvement, and decades of Vietnamese struggle before that, Saigon had fallen. The city would soon be renamed Ho Chi Minh City, after Ho Chi Minh, the revolutionary leader who had not lived to see final victory. North and South Vietnam were unified. But victory came at a terrible cost. Millions were dead. Vietnamese civilians on both sides. North Vietnamese soldiers. Viet Cong fighters. South Vietnamese troops. More than 58,000 Americans. And countless lives permanently scarred. Villages had been erased. Forests poisoned. Cities shattered. Families divided across oceans and ideologies. A mass exodus followed. Hundreds of thousands fled the new communist government. Some by road. Some by hidden routes. Many by sea. They became known to the world as the boat people. Fragile vessels crossing dangerous waters in search of survival. For the United States, Vietnam became more than a military defeat. It became a wound. Trust in government had been broken. The military returned demoralized. Veterans often came home not to parades, but to silence, confusion, and political bitterness. The war divided a generation, and its shadows stretched for decades. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated in Washington, D.C. A black wall of names. More than 58,000 Americans dead or missing. No heroic statues of victory. Just names. Reflection. Silence. A nation trying to understand what had happened. In Vietnam, the country emerged united, but devastated. Agriculture ruined. Industry shattered. Land still scarred by bombs, mines, and chemicals. Victory had come. But peace would take far longer. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of Vietnam. It was never simply a war between North and South, or communism and capitalism. It was a war of empires, ideologies, pride, fear, and human endurance. A war where military victory and political defeat could exist at the same time. A war where the strongest military in the world could not force belief. And where a small nation, broken again and again, refused to disappear. Vietnam did not just change Southeast Asia. It changed America. It changed warfare. And it left behind one permanent lesson. Entering a war is easy. Leaving it can take generations. But even after the guns fell silent, Vietnam did not truly end. Not for the soldiers. Not for the families. Not for America. And not for Vietnam itself. Wars may end with signatures and surrender. But their consequences live for generations. For the United States, the question became unavoidable. How had the most powerful military force on Earth failed? How had a superpower, armed with bombers, aircraft carriers, satellites, and 500,000 troops, lost to a smaller, poorer nation fighting largely in jungles and villages? The answers were painful. Some blamed politicians. They said Washington had fought with hesitation. Too many restrictions, too much fear of China and the Soviet Union, too much political calculation. Others blamed military strategy. Search and destroy. Body counts. Bombing campaigns that destroyed landscapes but failed to break political will. Some blamed corruption in Saigon. A government too weak to inspire the people it claimed to defend. And many blamed the original assumption itself. The belief that Vietnam could be understood as a simple Cold War battlefield. Because for many Vietnamese, it was not just communism. It was nationalism. Independence. The memory of foreign occupation. French rule. Japanese occupation. And then American intervention. For Hanoi, the war was presented as liberation. For Washington, it was containment. Each side believed history was on its side. That made compromise almost impossible. The war also changed how America saw itself. For decades after World War II, the United States had lived with the confidence of victory. It had defeated fascism. It had rebuilt Europe. It had become the leader of the free world. Vietnam shattered that certainty. Now there was doubt. Could American power really solve every crisis? Could military superiority guarantee political success? Could leaders always be trusted when they spoke of war? The answer, for millions, became no. This became known as the Vietnam Syndrome. A deep public reluctance to enter another long foreign war without clear purpose and clear victory. Future presidents would feel its shadow. Every intervention after Vietnam would be measured against it. Every war would raise the same haunted question. Is this another Vietnam? For American veterans, the return home was often lonely. Unlike the triumphant homecomings of World War II, many Vietnam veterans returned quietly. Some were welcomed. Many were ignored. Some faced anger from a country that no longer knew how to separate the soldier from the war. They carried memories that did not disappear. Ambushes. Jungle patrols. Friends lost in seconds. Villages burning. Helicopters lifting into gunfire. For many, the war followed them home. Post-traumatic stress, though not widely understood then, became part of thousands of lives. The war did not end at the airport. It simply changed location. In Vietnam, victory brought reunification, but not immediate peace. The new communist government imposed political re-education camps. Former South Vietnamese officers, officials, and intellectuals were imprisoned. Economic restructuring created hardship. Private businesses were seized. Suspicion shaped daily life. Many who had once supported the South feared the future. That fear created another human tragedy. The boat people. Families escaped under darkness. Fishing boats overloaded with refugees drifted into dangerous seas. Storms. Pirates. Starvation. No certainty of rescue. Only the hope that somewhere, beyond the horizon, another country might allow them to live. Many never arrived. Many did. And they carried Vietnam's unfinished story across the world. Even nature remembered the war. Millions of unexploded bombs remained buried in fields and forests. Children found them decades later. Sometimes with fatal consequences. Agent Orange, sprayed to strip forests bare, left wounds that lasted beyond the war itself. illnesses, birth defects, generations living with invisible scars from chemicals dropped years before they were born. War had entered the soil, and the soil remembered. Yet history moves forward. In one of the strangest turns of the century, the former enemies slowly found each other again. In 1995, the United States and Vietnam formally restored diplomatic relations. The same two nations that had once fought one of the bloodiest wars of the Cold War now reopened embassies. Trade followed. Tourism followed. Former battlefields became places of memory. American veterans returned to villages where they had once fought. Some searching for forgiveness. Some searching for understanding. Sometimes both. History did not disappear. But it changed shape. Even men who once stood on opposite sides of rifles could sit together in old age and speak not as enemies, but as survivors. Perhaps that is the final truth of Vietnam. Wars are often remembered through generals, presidents, and maps. But wars are lived by ordinary people. The farmer whose rice field became a battlefield. The mother waiting for a son who never returned. The pilot flying into anti-aircraft fire. The nurse in a field hospital. The child running from napalm. The refugee on a wooden boat staring at open sea. The protester in America holding a sign outside the White House. The veteran standing silently before a wall of names. History remembers strategy. People remember loss. And Vietnam remains one of the clearest reminders that winning battles is not the same as winning peace. That military strength cannot always defeat political conviction. That fear can create wars, but cannot always control how they end. And that once a nation enters a conflict built on pride, ideology, and survival, there may be no clean exit, only consequences. The Vietnam War ended in 1975, but in truth, it never fully ended. It still lives in memorials, in foreign policy debates, in family stories, in scarred landscapes, in names carved into black stone, and in one lasting warning whispered by history itself. Before a nation goes to war, it should first ask, how will this end? And perhaps the most haunting part of the Vietnam War is that its lessons keep returning. Because Vietnam was never just about Vietnam. It became a mirror, reflecting how nations see power, pride, and fear. Long after 1975, American presidents studied Vietnam like a warning written in blood. Every major conflict after it carried the shadow of comparison. When troops were sent to Lebanon, people asked, will this become another Vietnam? When helicopters landed in Somalia, the same question returned. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the comparison became impossible to avoid. A superpower, a distant land, insurgency, unclear victory, public fatigue. The phrase, another Vietnam, became more than history. It became a political ghost. Presidents feared it. Generals studied it. Citizens remembered it. Because Vietnam proved something terrifying. A war can be fought brilliantly on maps, and still be lost in reality. The battlefield is not always where victory is decided. Sometimes it is decided in public trust, in political patience, in the will of ordinary people to continue sacrificing. And in Vietnam, that will eventually broke. The war also changed journalism forever. For the first time, war entered the living room almost in real time. Television cameras followed soldiers into burning streets. Americans watched body bags, executions, napalm victims, young men dying in villages most viewers had never heard of. There was no heroic distance, no clean myth. The war was visible, and visibility changed everything. Governments could no longer control the story as easily as before. Credibility became a battlefield of its own. When official optimism clashed with televised destruction, trust collapsed. This gave rise to what many called the credibility gap. The growing belief that government statements could not be taken at face value. That suspicion did not end with Vietnam. It spread into politics, intelligence, and public life for generations. Vietnam also transformed the military itself. The U.S. Army that left Vietnam was exhausted. Morale was low. Discipline had eroded. Drug abuse, racial tensions, and disillusionment had damaged the force from within. The draft had become deeply unpopular. Many believed compulsory service had created an army filled with resentment rather than purpose. After Vietnam, America shifted to an all-volunteer military. The professional armed forces of today were shaped directly by that decision. The military would never again look the same. For Vietnam, reunification brought sovereignty, but also decades of hardship. The victory over the United States did not create instant prosperity. The economy struggled. Isolation from much of the Western world slowed recovery. Entire generations grew up among ruins left by war. But Vietnam endured, rebuilt, adapted, and eventually emerged as one of Southeast Asia's most resilient nations. That resilience may be the most extraordinary part of the story. A country invaded by colonial powers, bombed by superpowers, divided by ideology, scarred by famine, occupation, and war. And still it survived. Still it rebuilt. Still it moved forward. History often remembers nations by who conquered them. Vietnam is remembered by who failed to break it. Even today, travelers walk through Ho Chi Minh City, once Saigon, and see motorcycles racing through streets where tanks once rolled. Children laugh near places where bunkers once stood. Cafes stand where embassies once burned documents before evacuation. Life moves forward, but memory remains underneath. Quiet. Permanent. At the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, people still touch names carved into black stone. Some leave flowers. Some leave medals. Some simply stand in silence. On the polished surface, they see two reflections at once: their own face and the names of the dead. That may be the perfect symbol of Vietnam. A war that forces every generation to see itself reflected inside it. Not just what happened then, but what we believe now. About power. About patriotism. About sacrifice. About truth. And about the cost of being wrong. Because in the end, Vietnam was not a story of heroes and villains. It was a story of human decisions. Some made from fear. Some from conviction. Some from pride. Some from survival. Young men followed orders. Families endured consequences. Leaders made choices they could never fully undo. And history judged everyone differently. Some still call it a necessary stand against communism. Others call it one of the greatest strategic mistakes in American history. For Vietnam, it was both liberation and devastation. For America, it was both courage and failure. For the world, it was proof that modern war had changed forever. There are no simple endings in Vietnam. Only layers. Only ghosts. Only lessons people keep trying to relearn. Maybe that is why the story still matters. Because somewhere, in every generation, leaders again believe they can control chaos. That they can enter a foreign land, shape its future, and leave on their own terms. Vietnam stands there like a warning. Quiet. Patient. Unmoved. Reminding them that war does not obey intention. That power does not guarantee understanding. And that the price of arrogance is often paid by the young. So when we ask what Vietnam was, the answer is not only found in dates or battles. It is found in silence after gunfire. In families missing someone at dinner. In old soldiers who still wake at night. In fields where bombs still sleep underground. In refugees who still remember the sea. And in nations that still hesitate before sending another generation to war. Because Vietnam was not just a war. It was a lesson. Written across decades. Paid for in millions of lives. And still asking the same question. Before the next war begins, have we learned anything at all?